Is up, theology nerds? This is Trip. Oh, yeah. And you are listening to Homebrewed Christianity. Since the year 2008, we've been bringing you interviews with some of the best scholars from those ivory towers, trying to bring their wisdom, nuggets of truth, right into your earbuds so you can think, reflect, and wrestle with some of the best scholarship around. And today, is no exception, because it's a party. It's a process party. I am going to be joined by two amazing guests, Catherine Keller, Jacob Erickson, both process theologians, and we tackle a host of different topics. We talk about the apocalypse, the one in the book of Revelation, and all the apocalyptic struggles that are going on currently. We talk about queer theory and its relationship to process thought, apophatic thinking, and how it reframes our relationship to certainty and finality. Oh yeah, this is one zesty episode, and it was streamed live because it was a process party. But before we jump in, I want to let you all know something super duper zesty on the horizon. We have a home brewed seminar. That is right. This special event is just for the Homebrewed community members. It includes two elements. Element one, you have a lecture, a guest lecture from Dan Stiver, who's part of the Paul Ricoeur Society, helped start it, introducing, guess what? Legendary philosopher Paul Ricoeur, his thinking, and really focusing on the nature of hermeneutics. You know, when people use that, I'm going through the desert of criticism to a second naivete of faith, leaving past that original one, that bit, Paul Ricoeur getting popularized. Well, Dan Stiver and I recorded a lecture of him introducing Paul Ricoeur's life and thought, and I'm going to be sending it to everyone that's part of the Homebrewed community. And then you'll be getting an invite to join us live for a Q&A discussion about Paul Ricoeur, his life, his work, and in particular, a special selection of reading that digs into the hermeneutical arc that Paul Ricoeur's developed. This is some philosophical nerdiness. So if you want to join the Homebrewed community and be a part of this, go to homebrewedcommunity.com. Not only will you get invites, to members-only things like this gathering, but you'll be able to contribute to this podcast, this continued flourishing. You will get access to the members-only podcast feed with tons and tons of episodes and lectures and all the audio from the Homebrewed reading groups just right there. So, get ready, Homebrewed community, for a little fun engagement with Paul Ricoeur and Dan Stiver. Head to homebrewedcommunity.com if you want to be a member. Now let us party. Let's party. Let's process party. Hello, everyone. This is Trip, and I am here with the one and only Catherine Keller and Jacob Erickson at the very same time. Why? Well, because this is a process party of the apocalyptic variety. And I said to myself, if we are going to have a process party and get apocalyptic at the same time, who do I want to do that with? Clearly, these two. So I don't know if that's a compliment or like that you're just known for getting apocalyptic, the process variety, or maybe I just picked the topic just so I could hang out with you two because I'm lonely in a basement in Scotland and wanted to spend time with you. But there's a lot of reasons to be here, and I'm glad to do so. And I thought, as we get things started, this is not on my list of topics I sent you, but this is not a hard one, is for each of you to ask the other one a question that will get the other to share maybe a story or a bit of info that the average person who's interacted with you online, reading books and stuff, won't know.
This might be a different kind of approach. I know, so Catherine, in my experience, always has a very unique and wonderful sense of visual art. and the artists that she often engages with like her books, her book covers, and things like that. And so I'm maybe like when you're writing and thinking about like what you want your books to look like, or what kind of images you want to go with it, like what's your thought process, and what draws you in with a really good piece of visual art?
Oh, Jake, right. I mean, I think I should just lie down on my couch and let you psychoanalyze me, since, both of my parents, my blood father, Milton Cohen, whom I did not grow up with, and my mother, Jane, were artists. They got together as painters, and it was a traumatic relationship that ended in divorce when I was 2. And the role of art in my life was always crucial. We were in a family situation where we couldn't keep jobs or anything, so we moved all over the country, the world, excuse me. But always my mother got us to museums. So there's deep family history that we're not going to surface any more of today. But I didn't know the painter who did this piece for my book, Wendy. This is Rick Mullen, actually. This is called Windy Cove for this new book. But I was delighted, and I was given many options. I suppose the two painters, who were most important to me at formative stages were Klee and Kandinsky. So, a little retrograde back there to that modern point, but I absolutely love the spiritual microcosms of Paul Klee, and I loved the force fields of raw colored energy of Kandinsky, and both of them, of course, were profoundly spiritual persons, very explicitly theosophical with Kandinsky, more indirect and subtle with Klee. So I'm going to stop there. So it evolves. Yeah. Sometimes I like to do a little sketching myself, a little painting. Maybe I'll find more time for that if I retire sometime soon.
Work it into the books as Jane Bennett has worked her doodles into the book. Yeah, I see. I didn't know that about the Kandinsky connection, because I've got a weird Kandinsky connection as well, where the one artist that I sort of was exposed to as a kid was a cowboy artist by the name of Walt Peel, who was influenced by Kandinsky, and he used to paint these wild rodeo scenes in the Kandinsky style, and his and the main sort of progressive artsy bar in back home was called the Blue Rider, and so that's where I sort of hung out with all the North Dakota progressive kids.
I love it. The cowboy version of Die Blaue Reiter.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Yeah, beautiful. I'm glad to hear about this cowboy side of you.
Yeah, there is that occasionally.
Cowboy Jake.
Cowboy Jake.
I have a pair of boots. I have a pair of hats. Yep.
Well, all right, Catherine. What question do you want to ask Jake?
Well, I'd like him to give us a little hint as to just where he is at this moment in his finishing up a certain book, and I'd love for us to just hear a little of his language about the kind of profound eco-poetics is at work, and maybe a hint of the way eco-poetics and eco-grief actually flow in and out of each other in his poetics, in your poetics, Jake.
Yeah, thanks. Which I'm always kind of working and thinking through. So the book is being finished up this summer. Oddly, writing about eco-grief. The Theopoetics of Planetary Feeling is what the subtitle is of it. And oddly delayed by sort of COVID on one hand and my grandmother's death on the other, and a number of griefs of my own, but coming along in really interesting ways. So I guess it really came through in my dissertation. One of my chapters was on tragic beauty and in the Anthropocene, and the different ways that we sort of have to think through beauty and sort of stare into the wounds of the planet in some really difficult ways, given the fact that a lot of things have changed that we can't really quote unquote fix, and what fix would look like anyway, even as the urgency of the climate crisis demands us. And so I started reading a lot in that process on a lot of psychologists and a lot of psychoanalysts and a lot of folks who are working in this emergent concept of eco-grief and climate grief and environmental despair and ecological affect, and all of the emotional ways that we encounter planetary life, and really found that it was through Trebby Johnson, Radical Joy for Hard Times, that talked about, when we stare into ruined places, it stares back and it disarranges us and our expectations of what it means to be in place. And that she used the language of disarrangement, and what does it mean to be in that disarrangement in such a way to be invited to commit yourself to gazing in that place, to commit yourself to creating acts of what she called guerrilla beauty, in collaboration with a wounded place, such that something new might emerge. And that's really, to me, sort of the emergent space of how I was experiencing grief for my fracked Western North Dakota homelands, and what might be created here as a grieving process. And I think that's, for me, is a really theological task, a theopoetic task, a poiesis of making in collaboration with a space. So I've been writing this book on various different kinds of understandings of grief, environmental despair, ambiguous loss, sort of disenfranchised grief that's not recognized as grief, but is clearly in our bones, in mineralic ways. And so I've been thinking about what does it mean to write theology as a practice of grief and as a practice of constructive grief, such that we can poetically hold all of these disarrangements, and also acknowledge that they're not necessarily to be concluded or finished off or resolved, and that it's a process of living in the wake of climate change, lifelong process, vocation, maybe even. That's kind of where I'm at.
Not a grief that we get over. Well, everyone, aren't you pleased that I happened to ask that question of that man? Yes. Thank you for such revelation of where this amazing work is taking us, Jake. Yeah.
So between Zoom and Facebook and YouTube and Twitter, there's just under 300 people currently on the stream. And I got a whole bunch of different questions from people before that I told y'all kind of organized. But, I'm hoping to just chaperone the conversation between two brilliant friends enough that those who sit questions feel like help shape the conversation, but y'all's genuine interest and care and the way y'all think together is really the centerpiece. So feel free to interject and send each other down different trajectories whenever it makes sense. And otherwise, it would be anti-process for me to follow my outline with fundamentalist zeal. But one of the questions that came in that I think might be a real a fruitful way to start is both of you in different ways see the apocalypse upon apocalypses that are just like lining up today as something we need to address and haven't as constructive theologians. And trying to do the theological task involves wrestling with all the apocalypses of the present in different ways than the church has handled the apocalypse in the past, and in different registers than our current economic cultural system has to wrestle with them. So maybe you could each share a bit about how you would frame our current moment as a space for theological reflection that's generative and hopefully an invitation to a life-giving way of being.
Want me to start this time?
I think that's right to you.
Right. Let me hold up the book again. My book is just out, so Facing Apocalypse, with the subtitle Climate, Democracy, and Other Last Chances. And your question's excellent, Trev, because it gets us in there to the question of how theologically to meditate on our present situation in terms of apocalypse, but vice versa also, how to meditate on the apocalypse, the ancient one, in terms of our present situation, because we have to keep that a both way interchange, since that book of Revelation has been so incredibly influential. So I wrote a book on the apocalypse in 1996, and I'm not a biblical scholar, but I was very worried at that point at how theologians, at least in the United States, were ignoring it unless they were right-wing or conservative, very conservative theologians. In Europe, at least, Jürgen Moltmann was touching seriously on eschatology and the apocalypse. And I was very worried about the way Ronald Reagan and his Christian crew were using it, and how it could justify a nuclear war, other forms of planetary destruction. So I wrote that back then. But I was very, very ambivalent towards the book of Revelation and John of Patmos, who's profoundly sexist or even misogynist, and bitter in ways that don't resemble the spirit of the Gospels. And yet he's a profoundly insightful prophet. So I worked on that ambivalence in the 90s, and I hoped I was done with it. And lo and behold, get a ways into this millennium, and I felt again that call to come back to the book of Revelation, because climate change especially is going to make sure that we constantly hear the term apocalypse. We're not going to escape it. We're not going to be able to just circumscribe it. And so whatever we think of the likelihood that we can get through the tremendously destructive forms of economic, social practices that are driving climate change, which is driving mass extinctions, et cetera. Whatever we think about the likelihood that we can get through it, however optimistic or pessimistic we are, something else is at stake. The apocalypse is just going to be around. It's going to be in our faces. It's going to be used in secular ways all the time. Like, I think what really hit me was the entomological study, the insect study called the insect Armageddon on the precipitous drop of insect life, down below 1/3 now in Germany. And then the next year, which is, I think it came out 3 years ago, the insect apocalypse, The Guardian called the study of the two Americas. And again, the word was being used in a totally secular way and appropriately. These weren't scientists saying it's all over, folks, give up. They're saying, listen, wake up, open your eyes. So it seemed to me that, again, as a theologian, it was important for me to help folk, Christian folk, and maybe some others too, to get better hold of the language of apocalypse. I'm going to try to get a little more succinct here, because I'm obviously too immersed in this. But so what I felt was we actually need to live into the root meaning of apocalypse and help other people to realize what it is and to say it over and over, ad nauseum, say it. Apocalypsis in the biblical Greek does not mean the end of the world. It doesn't mean destruction. It doesn't mean annihilation. Apocalypsis means eye-opening. It means disclosure. It means literally unveiling. And far from gloomy, this is why the party metaphor works for me. Actually, the most common ancient use of the term apocalypsis was for the unveiling of the bride on her wedding night. So it's the sexiest moment of the ancient known world. And that's the unveiling. And that's playing between the lines in John's Apocalypse, which ends with what? A wedding party, the New Jerusalem, and the Lamb. It's a great wedding party. So it seemed to me that we need to get out that apocalypsis means disclosure, not closure. In fact, that there is in the Bible no the end of the world. There is in the Bible, through centuries of prophetic writing, experience of and warning of horrific levels of destruction, of mass human and non-human destruction. And John's in that tradition and was foreseeing, rather accurately, wouldn't you say, that there would be huge levels of mass destruction, humanly, terrestrially, before things could perhaps undergo the radical transformation that was hoped for. So it feels crucial to me to use the word and use it right. Now, it doesn't mean just party, obviously. An apocalypse party is a rather dark kind of party, but it's a party that's got a brilliant darkness, to use that ancient mystical metaphor, a glowing darkness, because the point is if we can face the horrific patterning of our world in terms of imperial top-down power and imperial global economics, code the whore of Babylon with her 29 luxury products. So it's the beast of global imperial power and the great corn queen of global economics 2,000 years ago. Understood to be already bringing about terrible destruction. But to say it's not that John of Patmos was predicting what was going to happen in, 2030. Prophecy is not prediction. That's not what prophecy means. Prophecy is what I call a dream reading. Prophecy is a deep reading of patterns in our world, patterns that are so entrenched that they are going to have terrible long-term impact. And the prophets are warning about those entrenched structural patterns of oppression and greed and unfaithfulness altogether. They're warning, and they're expecting that the warnings won't be heard easily, that greater destruction would come first. And there's been unbelievable, unimaginable destruction already through the history that followed the book of Revelation, indeed through Christian history. And there might be yet quite a bit more. But the point isn't that the book of Revelation is predicting the factual outcome of human history. It's dream reading deep patterns that would go on and on and on and were felt to be relevant century after century after century and are still relevant now and are calling us to this eye-opening, this disclosure, and calling us not just to be afraid, but to take heart. That wedding party is really possible. It's really possible because we open our eyes, because we unveil the truth of our situation. And it's a truth with very dire parameters, but it's a truth that is not lacking in hope. Perhaps not optimism, but again, a dark hope. So I want to, I think, pause there. So that's what I did. I got into the book of Revelation in an actually very, very close reading. Again, because the metaphors of the unfolding clouds, the morning bird, mourning in Jake's sense of grieving, of the pangs of the earth trying to give birth, of the porn queen, of the weaponized word, but finally of that down to earth, New Jerusalem, that cosmopolitan hope. All of these metaphors seem like metaphorses that we want to confront now, and not to feed our dangerous pessimisms and our perhaps even more dangerous optimisms, but our shared capacity for transformation.
So Jake, what do you think when you're thinking of processing the apocalyptic moment? Because Catherine kind of just wove together the book of Revelation and different strands of her own thought while also discussing a dark apocalyptic party they were invited to and giving a feminist reading of the Whore of Babylon that, turns it against neoliberal capitalism and its, movement of extraction. I know. I'm just interested in what you're doing next after that. I mean,
well, I'd say that gives me hope.
Oh, yeah.
In a different kind of way. I'm loving I'm seeing the comments about the gender apocalypse reveal party is happening in the chat, which I'm absolutely loving, because of course that's talk about gender queer reversals, right? The gender reveal parties are precisely to pin down with the sort of clarity versus we might want to do something different. In a queer kind of way, but I mean, it's I think maybe that my interest in Revelation has been very very interesting because so coming out of a Lutheran tradition, Luther is famously sort of really skeptical about Revelation, that it's a Christian doesn't, like James does it actually preach Christ in his Christocentric imaginary. So should we even, as a Lutheran kid, I was always told, be careful when you get there. that might be a place that you don't necessarily want to go. And yet at the same time, while I was graduating high school, of course, or getting through, it was the height of the Left Behind series and all of the these millenarian sort of modes. And I became really fascinated about why people were interested in this. And so in high school, ended up with the local pastor reading Revelation together and reading historical criticism when I was like 17, trying to figure out what the heck was going on here, what the, varieties of things were going on. And then when I was in college, sneaked into one of Craig Kester, Revelation and the End of All Things book, one of Craig Kester's classes. And, his whole thing at the time was to say that, what does it mean to? Oh yeah, exactly. Yeah, Craig's book. It's a beast itself, like but he did this beautiful thing where he said, okay, what does it mean to read this in its actual context as a letter to actual historical people, and did the political and read of it. But then he also wove in all of the hymns and all of the music and all of the sort of artistic flourishes, the Dürer pieces and of art. And you get a sense in which like the the way that this particular apocalypse genre is so vibrantly interdisciplinary. It's like its own little liberal arts education in a tiny letter. And I think that's what really struck me is that rather than, of course, I didn't have Catherine's language at the time to really articulate those kinds of moves, but there was this sense in which that these recurring patterns of intensity and intense violence and release and singing over and over again were mimicking a kind of artistic resistance to something. And that was really compelling. And that artistic resistance was over and over and over again with a kind of ecological imagination where Christ is this, lamb beast thing. And it really, I think, oddly, going through the book in that way opened up the prophetic tradition to me differently, to see the ecological themes of, in Paul, creation growing in labor pains until now, the trees of the field clapping their hand, the crying of Cain's blood from the soil, that really the prophetic movements and thematics in biblical texts are earthly in a really profound way, and not perfect. Of course, they're always entangled with historical modes of misogyny and odd forms of power. But there's a sense in which, as Holmes Rollston said, that the ancient folks who wrote the Bible in all of their contexts knew their ecologies at a native range, and that's how they spoke and sung throughout how they understood oppression and liberation and hope. And so that just, I think it forced me to step back in the midst of my, my last year of high school. Graduation was 2001. And so I was in the wake of the sort of emergence of this militaristic response to 9/11 and the apocalyptic overtones of that. And so now I found myself in the ecological frame again, trying to figure out what does it mean to talk about the climate crisis without a sense of doomism to it, or a sort of a doomer litany. I just can't. There's something about the recitation of the losses that feels so much like a trapped trauma response to me, that we haven't really fully been able to articulate. So it's all that. I mean, I go back and forth on Revelation in a lot of ways. Like, is the heavenly city at the end just as, I think it's Stephen Moore's metaphor, that it's sort of like a mall with a nice tree and a flowing stream in the middle of it without much ecological life to it? Or is it actually a dedication to the sort of the divine solidarity with the earth? And I think it's both, right? But it's we're not going to lose it. Not going to lose the apocalyptic language anytime soon.
Mm-hmm. So we need to use it.
Yeah. There, in both of your answers, you brought up a couple things people had mentioned before around just how you both think about the tradition, poetics, apophatics, and how do you look at sources when thinking theologically around topics that are addressing the whole, our relationship to nature, our relationship to the tradition. Like Jake echoes his own geographical location where he grew up, but also his Lutheran tradition. Catherine's mentioned the way her family of origin, and then the relationship to particular art. Also both talked about Theopoetics before and apophatics. In John Tatominal had a specific question, but there are a number around. Both of you are very creative at how you relate to sources, traditions, communities of theory, and then you're open, but distinctively grounded in your tradition, and yet open. And so there are questions around it. But I'll read John Tatominal's question because it's here, and I don't want to not ask John Tatominal's question when he typed it out here, and I wish I could just make him pop up and ask it, but. Both Jake and Catherine weave apophatic theological strands into their process theologies. We should not be surprised that the student follows in the dark wake of his teacher. But I am curious to know why both believe that synthesis be necessary. What becomes of process when it is infused with the apocalyptic? Why does process need the apophatic? Does the apophatic also need process? Do we need both to cope with our current apocalyptic moment? Like in that, and I had very similar questions about how do you operate in a tradition, but you're pushing its edges? How do you move past logocentrism in theology and move to poetics? Like both of you have that kind of delicate dance. Do you have a specific response to John's, but also just advice on how to think theologically in generative ways?
Oh, John Titownil, hello there. I'm very honored that you've showed up, and grateful for a question that might allow me to think a little bit about the apophatic apocalyptic relation, which is a very odd one, and how the apophatic and the apocalyptic are together related to process thought. But yeah, in terms of just how to approach theological questions, how to approach the key religious texts and themes of our lives, I think you want to first of all approach with honesty. No holy BS. God isn't interested in like pious pretense. Whatever we're calling God is I would think only going to be faithfully tuned to if your theological questions are profoundly honest. That means surfacing your doubts, your worst doubts about whether even he exists. The doubts, your fears about, what if your queerness comes out, you're in an evangelical congregation, and your doubts, your fears have to be in there in your honesty, but also your deepest sense of attraction. What's really calling you, or in the process sense, luring you. You all know, I think, who tune in here, that the most rigorous and precise expression of the divine will in Whitehead is the lure, the divine lure. Which invites, which beckons, and yes, it has a delicately erotic edge to it. Of course, lure does, and you need to hear and feel what is really luring you. And if you're grounded in that honesty, and you find at least someone you can be fully honest with, even verbally, you will get the skills and the strategies you need then to translate in and out of very different contexts, in and out of sometimes quite conservative contexts. That's a particular hermeneutical skill. And I think a lot of you already are much better at it than I am. I'm kind of good at helping students to develop that skill, but I don't know that I have it myself, because I didn't grow up in a steadily Christian environment, let alone an evangelical one. So I came at it all from a very different angle, as the modern art background does suggest. So it's wherever you're coming from, having a prayerful space of really rugged honesty about hope, fear, and desire, that seems hermeneutically crucial to me. And then you can do all kinds of hermeneutical translations into context. You can do it playfully, you can do it very carefully, you can do it provocatively, you can do it as a social activist, exercising strong leadership. You can do it as a pastoral counselor. You can do it as a teacher, or you can do it as a parent. But those endless translations that were pushed into in our theological interpretations need to find roots. Roots, the word being radix for root, radical rootedness in your most vibrant, honest perspective. I don't know if that helps as a start, but I do want to address the apophatic and apocalyptic. If I could briefly, I could try briefly in relation to process thought. Well, my work on the apocalypse in this way kind of is in a mirror play with my book on the creation, Face of the Deep. In the Face of the Deep, I use process thought, other schematisms as well, but perhaps especially process thought, to deconstruct the false reading of the Bible as having a creation from absolutely nothing. So a kind of simple absolute beginning of the world out of nothing at all. It's not biblical. It has strong theological support and has to be treated with care and respect in most contexts. But it's very important to understand that it's actually meaningful, that it's not biblical. And Whitehead thought it was biblical, but he went a different way anyway. He was wrong about the Bible and its creatio ex nihilo. So Whitehead on the creation, that's who then for theology opens up a very systematic understanding of a kind of bottomless creativity of who knows how many worlds. Now, our universe certainly has a beginning, and it will have an end no time soon. Gives us no excuse to do what we're doing on the earth. So, and then with the apocalypse, I'm doing kind of the mirror opposite. I'm deconstructing the notion of an absolute end. And again, I'm saying on this, I'm being rather biblical. I don't claim to be a biblical literalist, but I think I'm biblically rather faithful in my understanding of the Alpha and the Omega. And I'm faithful to process thought in this. Because there's no absolute beginning and no absolute end of the creativity of the divine in endless relationship, endless and beginningless relationship to world, however many worlds, however infinite a multiverse that world might be. And at the same time, maybe more than a lot of process theologians, I know that we don't really know so very much about who God and God's self is, whether our language, even G-O-D and all, fits very well. So I'm part of an ancient Christian tradition of negative theology, of always suspending any certainty about Christian dogmas. And because of being freed from certainty, one is able to be honest and creative. And so it's not that apophasis shuts you up. I think it lets you communicate more fully and more creatively. And the apophatic in relation to the apocalyptic is crucial. The apophatic has to keep insisting, no, we don't know what the end will be. The Bible doesn't either. It doesn't talk about the end in any final sense at all. That there is a profound apophasis about where the universe or the multiverse or the creation is heading. But more importantly, much more importantly, we don't know where we as a species are heading. And John of Patmos was very tuned to that profound uncertainty, and so lifted up a creative vision of a hopeful transformation, but one that's come by very, very rigorously. So one has to stay apophatic with one's apocalypse, or else, one's just doing one more fundamentalist reading of the book of Revelation. And so I think all of this is a form of process theology, but that will come out in the process of our conversation. I'll pause there. Thank you.
After the deconstruction of beginnings, I'm trying to figure out which beginning I should begin with. I mean, there's a sense, I think, Catherine, about the apocalyptic language that, I mean, sort of progressive Lutheran-y context for me was that Luther's engagement with the apophatic was also an engagement with the apocalyptic in some ways, that Luther's hidden God. There's certain things that you don't look into God because you're going to sort of go mad, so to speak, in the apocalyptic speculation of what might happen to souls or ends or things like that. And yet he has this sort of, there's certain readings of Luther that are very much placing it with him within a sort of apocalyptic imagination. Heiko Obermann's biography, for instance, and ways in which his own sort of Vitor Wessel calls it the burlesque language of the way that he talked about creaturely relations and sort of seeing apocalyptic scenarios in very real time for him was always certain. So I think, like, for me, when in engaging some of the apocalyptic language, there was also a kind of sense in which I was engaging with the apophatic or the unspoken in a different kind of way. And then after reading Luther, someone handed me Pseudo Dionysius, and you get to see the sense in which Dionysius, or the Pseudo, does the apophatic play as a sort of invitation to transgress that kind of language. If there's just so much you can't say, therefore say everything as you possibly can. God is a drunkard. God is rock. God is right. And that sort of creative engagement with the apophatic. And that's kind of where it interests me, is that sort of that creativity of language, which I so often recognize in nature writers. Everybody from Annie Dillard to a number of folks, and the ways in which there's sort of the ability and the desire to describe context with a kind of humility, I guess, with a kind of ecological humility, means that one can do as much play of language as possible, and then also acknowledge that you can't fully sort of grasp another creaturely thing with the very language that you're using, which has still been a dangerous inheritance of certain forms of Christian theology, where the desire to name the other creatures is also a desire to ensnare them, to describe them fully. And maybe that's where the apophatic John comes to be really important for me. That on one hand, one could simply say that we can't really fully articulate anything, which is kind of a nihilistic position. Can't describe our ecological contexts, can't describe in analogical ways relationships to the divine in ways that might lead us to cherish them or to desire them more fully. And then on the other hand, one might say that you could describe them fully, and that's a good taxonomy, and that might lead you to sort of taxidermy the contexts that are around. And so I think the apophatic offers this sort of play, not just for the divine, but for our intercreaturely relations that allow us to sort of have a kind of back and forth where we are always sort of playing with the edges of our relations with one another. And that makes it more exciting to me, because it means that there's not a taxidermied way of using language, but in fact, it is a living back and forth of creaturely interaction. That means that sometimes creatures resist us and our language, and sometimes the ways we talk about creaturely love sort of just unpacks our sense of what it actually is. The object escapes us in a desiring way. It's kind of where my mind goes with that.
And your sense of playfulness is, of course, never far from your sense of grief. And that's very important. This isn't a reckless or a silly kind of play. it might make light of oneself sometimes, and of one's uncertainties and those of those with whom one is communicating. But it's a play of profound seriousness at the same time, which is why it stays in touch with that mystery. But I want to just say one more thing about the epiphatic, because of where you were taking it, Jake, and precisely in relation to ecology. It's of great importance that we name a whole lot of facts, and some of them with a high degree of likelihood. Like I'm thinking about the life of the sea, because in the book of Revelation, that was one of the signals that really, got to me, chapter 8, 9, where you have the opening of the seventh seal, and what is that? There's the burning of a third of the trees of the earth, and a dying of a third of the life of the seas. That hit me hard a few years ago, because that was just about where we were by most estimates with the burning of the life of, the dying of the life of the seas. So, and I just recently encountered the fact from two recent UN study, right? One UN study, the most recent, says that 50% of the life of the sea will be dead by the end of the century. There's another UN study that seems at odds with it, that says that 49%, it's awfully close to 50, 49% of the life of the sea has died since 2000, since the year 2000. So a little apophasis is needed here too, right? I mean, these are kind of contradictory scientific projections of numbers, but that doesn't erase them. They're saying something very dire, even though clearly they can't both be exactly precisely true. Because if we've already done 49%, we're going to get to a whole lot worse than 50% by the end of this century, right? You get that. And they're both United Nations studies. So one needs a certain wise attention to uncertainty, even when dealing with scientific facts, not in order to discount the facts, but in order to work more, scientifically with them, in fact, to work responsibly with them. So and then it becomes much more complex, as you were going at with theology, in terms of how we work with what we might think of as certain, because it's given in faith, even though with Luther, et cetera, faith never translates into certainty. Certainty would be an idolatrous reduction of faith to knowledge. But we need to work always at that edge, and as you're saying, work at that edge, but play at that edge as well.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah, the play is such an interesting thing, because I think, so many folks think the playfulness is a kind of either anything goes, or it doesn't have any local guts to it. But any psychologist will tell you that play is precisely the learning at the edge of uncertainty for adolescents and for kids as they try to figure out social conventions or create relations with one another. And it just seems so important to me that the grief work is precisely sometimes needs a bit. Sometimes you need to laugh at a funeral. I mean, and it's not about giving up, but it's precisely about how one honors memory in a different kind of way, or how one relearns one's relationship to what's been lost in any sort of context. And that faith piece that you mentioned too. I mean, this is for John Tamnell. That's a Tillich moment, right? That faith is doubt is not the opposite of faith. It's a dynamic of it in a different kind of way. So that's an apophatic move too, and it requires a bit of possibility for how we local. The one thing I might add is that it seems to me more and more important in talking about the climate crisis, this question of planetary scale. And that's where the apophatic becomes really important to me, because it seems that in a lot of the environmental movements, in trying to communicate scientific fact and scientific urgency on a planetary scale, sometimes those planetary facts wipe out more local injustices or manifestations of it. And so the interplay of how folks locally describe their experience in ways that might mysteriously not be seen on a planetary scale, and vice versa. What does it mean to experience a 1 degree warming in X location at any given time? One might not actually feel that, oh yes, clearly that's changed on a planetary scale in my one location. So there's a weird planetary apophatic move as one's thinking of locales and scale. In time too, but geophysically.
Yeah. Oh, that's so crucial to keep that play, that work at that tense edge between the local and the global alive, vibrating, to keep what is most intimately locally embodied in our communities, in our bodies, actually, very, very vivid and within its own range of forces, of energies, and of sufferings, of oppressions that we need to work at. So that locality is like crucially where our energies are embodied, and how they then can come forth into something with global impact, since it turns out that every little bit, especially if you're Whiteheadian, every little electron is actually related to all the other electrons on the globe and beyond. So we don't escape it. I was just part of an interesting discussion group. I was glad to be part of it, because they were almost all political scientists and political philosophers responding to an essay by Richard Falk. And his essay was, "Can Human Solidarity Globalize?" So we were all writing these one-page things that were going out every day of June on, can human solidarity globalize? And it was really satisfying to be in a very international conversation about the deep challenge, because of course we're always having to resist what Falk was calling the tribalisms that disconnect us from the global force of the neoliberal economy and its devastating impact, the global reality of our ecological interdependence. So it's very, very important to push against that so-called tribalism, but I push back against calling it tribalism, because I think actually the original tribes around the world still very alive in parts of Africa and Latin America and even the United States and Canada. Those tribal wisdoms know all about the intricate microcosmic connection of every creature to all the others in its world. It's Western global civilization that actually broke us into separate individuals. So it's not for me about going anti-tribal, but finding a way to break free of the ways in which we get artificially and oppressively separated from the world of which we are absolutely a part, vulnerable to and responsible for. And there is movement towards a more planetary consciousness. And one can hope that the worse things get with climate change and through the suffering of COVID, one can hope that the awareness of the sensitivity, the dangerousness, the precarity of our globality can call some critical mass of us to more active responsibility.
Yeah, that's really helpful. I feel like there's like a graduate school class syllabus outline after you two answer a single question, that I don't know if y'all have taken up that consulting option for people working on syllabi, but y'all should consider it. When
I don't think it'll pay.
Yeah, well, you can, if you decide not to work on art in your retirement, you can do that. One of the things I'd be interested in how y'all see this. I'm probably on the I don't know, more definite side of process. Like the ones that like being a lot more clear than a lot of my apophatic friends are. But when I saw the question, there's like two things in the apophatic reflection and in how the apocalypse functions that have strong resonance with process thought. And one is apocalyptic thinking, apophatic thought, and process thought involve a negation of finality. Like whatever is inherited in the moment involves a kind of negation of finality, be it the positive attestations or the received superstructure that dominates the world, right? Or the past and pure repetition. All of them have this way in which the creative moment, right? Be it living in response to the lure of God or doing constructive theological reflection or thinking about global politics or whatever it is, involves that negative movement. And the other is that process apophatic and apocalyptic thinking in the biblical sense. The negation is not to make space for oneself, but to make space for the possible, right? And so the negation of your language, definite language about God, is on behalf of the God unspoken. And not because God can't be spoken, but because God won't be. Right, in some sense, and that the apocalyptic, you're making space for what? Behold, I make all things new, or a new heaven and a new earth. But it's a new heaven and a new earth that hasn't forsaken the old one. And then how is that even possible under the imperial grasp of our imagination, the cultivation of our desires online? Like there are all these ways, and yet what do we make space for? Right, it's like the coming of the new, and that coming of the new is so connected to the eros of the divine in its relationship with the possible. And so I feel like if you were at least for me, if you're thinking about ways process, apophatic, and apocalyptic connect, especially from a process one, it has that moment of negating finalities and making space for something more than any one theologian, one tradition, one community, one wisdom can possess.
I just want to say briefly, yes, amen. Negation of finality, not of finitude.
Yeah.
That needs to get blasted out there. It's a negation of finality in the sense of fin, F-I-N, finished. Not finitude. There's endless loss and death, and a lot of it unnecessary, hence the grief work, but hence also the attunement to the possible. So you're right. There's a kind of double negation in the negation of any absolute finality that then opens up. It discloses the possible. I've been thinking recently about how misinterpreted the gospel on the possible. With God, all things are possible. Gets, it's so often taken to mean God can do anything. And that's not the point. The point that is, it's not that God's going to do it either. It's with God. And with God, we are able to actualize something that is possible, that might not have been possible before. It doesn't mean we can do anything. It doesn't mean that God can do anything, because God's power doesn't work that way. It's not top down in the imposition of actualities. It's the lure of the possible, and therefore the really possible novum, right? Possible, not therefore probable, not guaranteed, but the possibility is enlivening. What do you think, Jake?
Yeah, Jake, what do you think?
I mean, also amen, or all of the chorus after the, I mean, it makes me think of in practice of the distinction between theopoetics and theopoetry a little bit. I mean, that we, in an odd way, that we tend to imagine theological language or our response to divine lore oftentimes as in a crass neoliberal technological way, as in we are making something that we can do something with for the consumption of, or for the response of, versus, you know, if this God word is poet of the world, that the embodiment of language and the embodiment of our bodies in coalitional forces and relational forces is the theopoiesis in different kinds of ways that make newness or that embody newness rather than try to sort of enact newness. And then that also lures forth newness in it. So I think it's a shifty. I've been reading a lot of Eastern Orthodox theology lately, not necessarily because I'm seduced by the overarching mood, but because of the language of that theopoiesis and transfiguration, and the ways that it really is a more holistic sense of body and a holistic sense of that new creation that precisely doesn't necessarily negate finitude, but intimates creation into something divine, or does a kind of divinity. Though, of course, Orthodox theology wouldn't, necessarily even get that radical on that edge. But I do think about it quite a bit in that language of new creation. I think it's interesting because it's an embodied thing. It's also a prophetic call itself. It's also a call to do, and it's a call to embody language differently.
Mm-hmm. So there are a couple questions I think that connect to where we've just been, and there were a number around the connections between process thought and queer theology or queer thinking, right? Like, and what would it mean to queer theology from a process lens, right? And then another person texted and said, I just found out about process thought after I ditched growing up fundamentalist. I came out queer. I got ditched by my family and church. And when I typed in queer theology, a lot of process people came up. I don't really know where I'm going with this. That's the gist of the email. So I thought maybe there's some that are much more comfortable and already get what's going on if you say I'm queering something or queer thinking. But could you give an introduction to the connections of process and queer thinking, and then what that looks like, in a more in-depth way for thinking through your own work? Because I don't want to leave out someone who is showing up on a live stream and going, I came out, I typed in queer and theology, and people on this live stream showed up. So give the intro part, and then what is that like in the academy when the queer theory, process thought interact to, discuss divine becomings?
You want to start, Jake?
Yeah. Well, maybe there are three things that I could say with which link queer theory and process thought for me, importantly. And one is the becoming piece of materiality, right? That early on queer theory was all about sort of iterations of gender performance in a lot of ways, and the cultural construction of gender. And it always seemed to me that in process thought, what you had was a sense of creativity that allowed for that kind of space, that the materiality of bodies and the cultural becomings of bodies and people precisely was indeterminate and really could fundamentally become, could change, could transform, could perform itself differently from moment to moment to moment, iterative becoming, sort of things move with difference even as they cite what's come before them. And that's kind of a common piece for me, that indeterminacy of matter, that taking moves to get there naturally, but that's one of them. A second one is fundamentally an imagination of the divine as eros, as desire, as lure, that rejects a certain kind of heteropatriarchal this reading of God in the sky, with a kind of gender binary that gets sort of proliferated in churches and in Christian theology. And so process thought offered a different way of encountering or seeing or imagining divine empowerment or divine seduction in ways that was erotic, that was different than coercive power, that was different than a sort of hyper-masculinist divinity that wasn't necessarily making space for the other images of the divine that were incarnated in planetary life. And the third, I think, is a kind of, importantly for me, an open reading of the future that I think oftentimes there's a lot of new things about queer temporality, where the future is read with a very kind of heterosexist imaginary that sort of, we will save the planet for our children and our children's children, and that child just happens to look iteratively into the future like a lovely sort of heterosexual family with 2 kids and upholding a safe social structure into the future indeterminately. And I think one of the things of process with its emphasis on novelty and newness means that there are other ways of imagining intergenerational realities that might offer new space for, even given the social power constructed ways that one imagines family or self, that we might emerge new ones in different kinds of ways. So those are the 3 things that always come back to me. That's maybe it's the play of it, the kind of play lured by a bit of desire in every single direction.
Yeah, beautiful.
Oh, I thought you were about to start talking, Catherine. You did. When you did this, I was like, "Oh, is that the?" I'm about to go.
I could, but Jake did that beautifully. Do you want to move on to another question, or?
Well, I guess one of the follow-ups that is it. So often the battle for inclusion in religious spaces is waged with the background binary as normative, right? Mm-hmm. And so even in more progressive Christian denominations, the battle for inclusion is let's recognize this element of difference as valid as, right, the normative binary husband and wife, like structure. And I don't think that the structure of the family is the only part the tradition has essentialized a binary, and then thought, if we're going to progress, in scare quotes for those only listening, or if we're going to grow or whatever, it's taking more particulars that were previously excluded from something good and insert them in the positive column, right? Like, we start adding letters to our list of inclusions and we feel like we get more points. But underneath both of your work is the way in which the same violence that gets itself done by assuming one kind of pairing as normative is the same kind of violence that gets itself done to the globe, right? Through a lot of our assuming as natural an economic machine and exploitation. and there's lots of these patterns too. Think of how bad, I mean, granted we're processed, so maybe this is assumed, but like how bad discussions about divine power are shaped by a like hyper patriarchal asshole deity, or like when we think of atonement, like debates, or like even election, they're like, are you Arminian or a Calvinist? You're like, I'm just going to go ahead and say whatever scale this is on, it's not good. Right. And so like one of the things I have found so life-giving listening to people who have queer identities and are part of my congregation or part of the academy and I've listened to, or theorists I've read and then learned from that are dead, is that there's so much more life to be benefited and make possible. And our task should not be, as leaders of institutions, the academy, churches, to just make space for someone else to show up where the terms are set by the inherited structures, but to bring all that difference, and then we re-envision ourselves, right? Like you adopt someone in your family doesn't tell you this is how you join us, you become new. Or the many and the one are increased by one. There's a kind of creative way of queering that's different than inclusion, but that preserves the infrastructure of oppressive binaries. Does that make sense? Like, I feel like there's so much to gain by queering things that if you don't recognize what's being problematized, you feel like you've won just by having a few new friends.
No, I think there is a kind of mysterious liberative force that the word queer has been unleashing now for decades, and it keeps coming into its own in new ways. And you're right; it has a lot to do with the creativity of the process cosmos, and a God luring us not to perfect some already established binary form, but luring towards greater complexity, right, and greater intensity. Those are the two hyper values in process reality. It's complexity and intensity. And queerness requires both. And it doesn't require you to cease being, like a man married to a woman in a fairly recognizably conventional form. It doesn't require you to give up that identity. It does require you to live your relationship to each other, even within your heterosexuality and within its possibly very, very straight kind of marriage commitment, but to live that relationship with freshness, with a kind of complexity and novelty that's going to open you to new registers of yourself, of your own so-called femininity, your own so-called masculinity, and is going to open into queerness that is experienced sensually. That doesn't mean that you're going to start having to practice other modes of sex. That's just way too simplistic and literal. But so whatever modes of sex one is practicing in whatever mode of relationship, there's something about the process God that's always trying to queer the cosmos, and queer the cosmos right where you are, intercarnate with everyone else in it, because you're not being invited to replicate some structure or mimic it in, even in some really hip LGBTQ way. I mean, the Q is crucial, that there's got to be an indeterminacy, an uncertainty that allows that playful creativity to happen, and therefore that honors God's call of us to greater complexity, and therefore greater intensity also for God. And clearly, what queerness is about has been a rich intensification and complexification of all that we mean by sex and gender. And, I'm celebrating my 25th marriage anniversary to Jason. I'm pretty boring in that way. And I just feel like I'd have a much flatter, emptier life and relationship to process theology, were it not for the waves of input that come from queer theology.
Mm-hmm.
One of my friends who's on my mind right now, Carol Wayne White, hasn't written much explicitly on how she connects her queerness to her African American identity and to her deep involvement in process thought. But I really recommend Black Lives and Sacred Humanity, because it gets at a sense of sacrality that's just always multiple, layered, and surprising, playful, even as it calls us into rigorous responsibility around, for instance, my whiteness, my straightness, and the ways in which those give me undue privilege. I think it's an interface that between process theology and queer theology that could use a lot more explicit unfolding than it's gotten so far.
Mm-hmm. Awesome. So I'm gonna ask one more question so we don't end up going over time wise, which Jake knows last time that happened very significantly. But this is one of our fun questions, and so I have to admit, Twitter sometimes sends a whole host of questions, or maybe I'll let y'all pick whichever one of the fun questions you want to answer. That way, so I'll read them all so everyone gets credit for sending questions that are not long theological questions that then I have to figure out if they make sense in a conversation. Fun questions people send in. Most underrated theologian and their zesty idea. The most overrated theologian and the idea you would like to mute. That's funny. A text that changed your mind. Favorite text to teach in the classroom. What complaint about process thought are you tired of hearing? What is the most compelling, personally? If you could have one song play every time you entered a room, what would it be and why? It's just real hard if you grew up watching WWF in the 80s not to think of your ring entrance song. So but I wouldn't want everyone to think I'm coming into a fight. And the last one is, what's a saying or expression that academics probably say too much? So you can pick any of them to answer. Do you have a particular one you'd like to answer? Otherwise, we would talk all night. I just think they're all fun.
They are all fun. I feel I want to do the most fuddy-duddy thing possible and say, yeah, the underranked theologian, way underestimated. It's Nicholas of Cusa.
Ooh.
Catholic cardinal from the 15th century. Anyway, I wrote all about him in my Cloud of the Impossible, and that's his phrase, Cloud of the Impossible, because he thinks that's what we have to confront, and it's painful to enter into the cloud of the impossible because it means we're facing into contradictions. For him, his whole Orthodox faith was conflicting with his theological intuitions, like his sense of God as the creator, which he knows well from his tradition, and as in control, dominating, and doing the creating, the moving, was in contradiction with his understanding of God as also creatable, as being moved, not merely mover. So I could go on and on about him, but I already did that in a book. But I just wanted to bring into play that image of the cloud of the impossible, his image, because it's a dark space that we enter when we find, that parts of ourselves or our lives or our faith and our experience are in contradiction, in conflict, our relationships. Mm-hmm. And it turns out there's an intense luminosity in that very cloud, that it's where one does encounter the divine in facing those contradictions. That's what he called the coincidence of opposites, the coincidentia mm-hmm. oppositorum. So that was my first answer.
So when the first time you were on the podcast, Catherine, mm-hmm. 10 or 11 years ago, at the end of it, I said, well, what's something you've gotten interested in recently? And you were like, Nicholas of Cusa. And I was right? Like, yeah. And I said, are you like, why are you into it? And you said, I don't know. I know. Because before you said, well, I know that you introduced me as a competitor for president of the John Cobb fan club with you. And I feel like I just have the ability to stay president until I let you be in charge. You were playing about that, but I'd only let John Cobb go if I got to be Cusa's president. And then you gave a pitch to be for why everyone should read Nicholas of Cusa. So if people are interested in fiery prophetic sermon, bring people to the altar of, the coincidence of opposites. If you go to the Barrel Age podcast, the oldest Catherine Keller episode is pretty fun. And
that's a funny coinciding of times. I guess that was about what I was getting going on that.
Yeah.
Yeah. But I would always recommend that folk read John Cobb first, but he's much less underestimated than is Nicholas of Cusa. Fortunately, I'm really glad that Cobb is probably recognized by a critical mass of theologians around the world as the most important living North American theologian, for instance.
Yes. All right, Jake. Which of the plethora of fun questions did you?
It is. Talk about a little bit of a queer carnival. Like I've got all the different questions in my mind swirling around that. I could say Eriugena and then go off on a whole theophanic riff. Most overrated theologian, men, just in general.
Like you mean the old Adam?
If I could set aside anyone named Carl Thomas Aquinas or at least sort of neo-Thomist moment, then I'd just be super, super happy. But yeah, no, I think I'd say the Eriugena piece, but I will say I said it to you before. The one piece of theology that changed my life was Tillich's "You Are Accepted." That small sermon that got me, and for a whole bunch of reasons, and I will never let it go. Just for the last lines of it, so.
Oh, it's a beautiful sermon. Mm-hmm. Well, Catherine, hold up the book again so everyone can see it. And, oh, look at that. Jacob also had.
This is beautiful student moment.
It's prepared. Prepared.
Indeed. Thank you.
This has been a ton of fun. I've really enjoyed it. And I just hope that when this is over, Jake and Catherine decide to talk to each other more on the internet because it's very pleasant and it makes my job really, really easy.